He was kind of like an oddball, I would say, in philosophy, kind of like a renegade thinker, someone who was really like outside of like these various labels and streams and traditions.
Today on MindMatters, we are joined by our special friend, Lucien Koch. Koch. Luke, maybe you should pronounce your name. Luke's a German.
Lucien, so first name is French, Koch, last name is German. So
okay, cool. Yeah, we met Luke on the street a few weeks ago and thought he was a cool guy, so wanted to have him on the show. No, we've known him for several years and decided to finally bring him onto the show because he shares our interests and he's fun to talk to. So, as our first show with Luke, we're going to be talking about a philosopher named RG Collingwood, author of several books, most well known for his work on the philosophy of history. He wrote a book called Idea of History, which was published posthumously, but he'd done work while alive, published essays while he was alive, but his, I guess, most important work on history was published after his death. But he wrote about all kinds of things. He wrote about the philosophy of art, of metaphysics, of religion, and some of his... Well, the odd thing about him is that he's a great philosopher, and his works are kind of famous in kind of a niche way, but he's not really recognized. And part of that was because he died fairly young. He died in, what was it, like 43 or something like that?
Something like that.
But he was only, this book doesn't have his birthday. He was only, he died when he was 54. Yeah, in 1943. So fairly young. His death he got sick and died young. And according to at least one article that came out recently, published in Prospect, what was the name of that article? Is how the untimely death of RG Collingwood changed the course of history forever, or something like that. How the untimely death of RG changed the course. Oh, philosopher, I got it. So we'll be putting a link to that article in the show notes. But one of his other kind of most famous books, at least among people who know of his work, is his Autobiography, a short work, like 150 pages or something, maybe not even that, or 160.
It was 100 and... see.
Well, something like that.
Yeah, 169 or something like that.
There it is. We've got a couple copies here, including the extended edition, the director's cut, the Zack Snyder cut.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking a bit about that. I've got this one. I haven't read his autobiography yet, but I read Idea of History. I read one of his first books, Speculum Mentis. I read his Principles of Art, which we've talked about on the show before. We talked about that on our show that we did on Joker, the movie last year. And I've been reading this one, Essay on Metaphysics, which is really interesting. So we'll be getting into probably just a bunch of his ideas, and then maybe a discussion on maybe philosophy in general. I know we were discussing with Luke last week the question of kind of what is philosophy good for, and so we'll have something to say about that. So, guys, Lucien, maybe what are your thoughts on Collingwood? Where do you want to start? Do you want to talk about his autobiography?
Yeah, maybe because that's really a very nice book that packs quite a punch. So I can really recommend it to everyone, even those who are not so much into philosophy and are a bit maybe shy away from the topic because they think it's a bit too crazy. So this is really very readable, and I think one of the things that really has impressed me with Collingwood is that he has this how you say, like capability to really bring forth his thoughts, even though it's complex thoughts, but he can really put it into words very nicely. And you can also really feel that he has something to say. So he's really there's fire behind it, so to say. That's my impression. And there are other philosophy books where you kind of have the impression, they're kind of shuffling little logical puzzle pieces around, and it's not really like this that you have the impression someone really has something to say. I mean, that's obviously not true for all other philosophy, but this is really one thing that I noticed with Collingwood. And maybe to get back to your point, Harrison, why he's not so famous, actually. I mean, hardly any people have heard of him, I guess, that are not specialists or maybe interested in the history in the philosophy of history, rather, because that's what he's really famous for. So people in that field, they know him because he has made quite a name of himself for that. But he's always considered this kind of niche philosopher. So it's a bit he was kind of relegated, into that corner. He talks about history and he talks about art, and it's not really the cutting edge of philosophy. The real philosophy deals with the philosophy of mind and all of that, and analytic philosophy nowadays, and that's actually, I think, very interesting that he didn't receive that much attention, neither from critics nor from like people who really like him or know him. He's kind of like in the background, and I think it might have something to do. And you can see that when you read his autobiography, that he kind of managed to offend about everyone. So his positions like weren't really popular. So, for example, I mean, he argued that that there are like absolute presuppositions, that is like unconscious assumptions or sometimes conscious assumptions that are logically prior to empirical science. So even though that basically implies that philosophy is kind of prior to science, right? So that really didn't go down well with all those scientists and philosophers who like were on a crusade, to eradicate metaphysics and basically say that most of philosophy is nonsense, and you cannot really like make sense of it, and all we need is like science, and this kind of scientism movement that was really, really strong also during Collingwood time, and empiricism and all of that. And here comes Collingwood and says, no, actually like metaphysics understood in a special way, we can talk about that later maybe, is actually prior to all of that. And you cannot, I mean, if you deny that we're dealing with the presuppositions and we bring them to the table, so to speak, then you deny your own foundation, even as a natural scientist. So that didn't go down too well. But on the other hand, there's people in theology and also some philosophers who are in the opposing camp who kind of think they can like figure out like eternal truth, like by philosophizing, things like proof of the existence of God, for example, that's still kind of popular among certain theologians, things like that. And Collingwood said, no, can't do that. So it's absolute presuppositions, as he calls it, something like I believe in God, or everything has a natural it's governed by natural laws and things like that. No, they're neither true nor false. So he's believed that these are just things that we presuppose, but we cannot really criticize them directly or show them true or wrong. So so I mean, that group he offended. I mean, then there's like what you might call the deconstructionists, even though they weren't really around under that umbrella during Collingwood times, but like they were the logical positivists and groups like that. They were kind of like deconstructionists in the sense that they wanted to do away, with a lot of things, and especially with metaphysics, and so that kind of school of thought that was just about eradicating philosophies, basically. So that's again, not what he thought, and he argued against that kind of thing, and he criticized psychology. I mean, that's also very interesting. So obviously at the time, Freud just came along, and the psychoanalytic movement was taking off. So didn't really make a lot of friends there, either. So, I mean, there's just a long list of people that he, that just couldn't deal with the kind of things he said. And maybe he was onto something, right? I mean, their silence maybe speaks for itself. But he was kind of like an oddball, I would say, in philosophy, kind of like a renegade thinker, someone who was really like outside of like these various labels and streams and traditions, and did his whole thing. And he was also, at least in my reading, he believed in like moral. I mean, he probably wouldn't say that he was a moral realist, but something like that. I mean, he's obviously believed in things like virtue and duty, and these concepts actually do mean something and have a deeper meaning that you can kind of figure out. He wasn't saying that you can come to like ultimate conclusions about behavior and things like that, but he obviously had the idea that there is something in thought, and in these concepts that kind of came to be over long periods of time by human thought, that actually have a very deep meaning. So, if you're a moral relativist, like many were and still are in philosophy, and kind of reject the idea that you can actually find anything resembling like truth in that field. So yeah, they didn't like him either. So yeah, the list goes on.
Well, the one more is even in, I think probably the only area where his ideas have kind of had influences where he's famous is in philosophy of history, but because he kind of, in a sense, like he wasn't a systematic philosopher in the sense that everything like fit together, but his thoughts on philosophy of history and even the practice of history, because he was a practicing historian as well, and as well as an archaeologist, they actually that system of thought kind of got integrated into scientific history, just because his thoughts were so clearly like laid out. And basically, one of the things he did was essentially just to define history, to say what it is actually that historians are doing, and just making clear what historians were actually doing. And by virtue of that, he had an effect. But even in the other place that you mentioned where he's kind of well known is as a philosopher of art, but even there he's unpopular. I was looking at the influence he had on philosophy of art, and like pretty much everyone just rejects everything he said about art because I can't remember what the justification was, but basically just because, again, his ideas were unpopular. I guess he was either too much of a romantic, or like, cause he thought that art was something like, I don't remember exactly what he thought, but something like the expression of, part of it was the expression of feeling, but as a way of, well, no, I'll leave it there because I don't want to be wrong about it. But his thoughts on art were actually very similar to a musicologist and a composer named Koch, who wrote a book called The Language of Music, who's also not very popular today, even though I read Koch and I read Collingwood, and they both seem pretty great to me on their respective fields. But I wanted to comment on a few things that you said about Collingwood. Right at the beginning, you talked about kind of what makes him special and how he's just the quality of his writing and what he conveys in his writing. One of the things I found about him is how clear his thought is. And like you said, even if he's writing about something complex, or some topic that in another writer's hands would come across as, or would be expressed in a convoluted, like almost incomprehensible way, he's very ordered in his thinking. So every like, at least in his later years, like some of his first work, like Speculum Mentis, kind of jumps all over the place a bit, and it's a bit more dense and difficult to follow. But by the end of his life, I found, just from my reading, like reading Essay on Metaphysics, which was one of the last works he wrote, it's almost simple. Like they're very complex ideas, and very, like, you know, talking about presuppositions and how like a relative presupposition will be the presupposition to an answer, which is the question to an answer, but also intermediate between the two, and like you can deliberately make it more complex than it is, but the way he lays it out, everything is always very clear, and you end up thinking, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I agree with that, because it makes such sense.
Can it really be so simple?
Yeah. Well, that's actually one thing that came to mind. I'm like, well, can it really be so simple? And maybe he's deceiving me with his clear thought. But even in his definition of science, because he's saying in this essay on metaphysics, he's asking the question, first of all, what is metaphysics? And so he gives an answer, and he goes back to Aristotle, who created metaphysics, because that's where we get the name of the word, and he was the first person to do metaphysics. And he says, oh, well, here, reading Aristotle, we can come up with two things. Like metaphysics is two things, but this one thing that Aristotle says it is impossible. Therefore, we will ignore that. It's not that thing. It is this other thing. It is the science of absolute presuppositions. And where was I going to go with that? Well, just that. I'll just leave that point there. That even if he's talking about something that seems as abstract and, oh, well, what's the point of that, as like metaphysics, his thought is clear, and by reading it and by understanding his position on metaphysics, you say, oh, well, that actually makes sense. That's actually useful. And you see what you were saying about how this made him unpopular. He's got a funny little passage in there where he's talking about when you encounter any scientist. The point I was going to make is that even his definition of science is that he goes back to the original definition of science. It's basically just like an orderly laying out thinking. Of an orderly thinking on a specific subject. So that's why you can have a science of logic, or a science of metaphysics, or a science of biology. It's you take a domain of something and you think orderly about it, and you arrange your thoughts in a logical order. And so what metaphysics is orderly thinking about absolute presuppositions. So you will analyze a statement, or analyze the science of anyone at any point in time, and you think orderly about that to determine what are the presuppositions behind what these people are saying. So he gives the example of Newton. Well, Newton had the absolute presupposition, and Newtonians in general, from the time and in that sphere, in that epoch, had the absolute presupposition that, what was it, that some things are caused. There are causes for some things and not other things. So some things some things happen because of a law, a scientific law, like the law of motion. So, but there are other things, like if something is in motion and is deflected from that motion, that deflection will be caused by something else. Whereas the motion itself was not caused; it was determined by a law. And then along comes like Kant, who says that everything has a cause, and then along comes Einstein that says nothing has a cause; it's all laws. But these are all absolute presuppositions, in the sense that you can't prove them, you can't argue with whether they're right or wrong. They are just what is supposed for that science to work. And even that, that gets me thinking, and I haven't orderly thought about it well enough, but it kind of corresponded to what I've been reading from, in a way, to what I've been reading from Ian McGilchrist, because Ian McGilchrist, like our listeners will know just from the few things we've said in the last few episodes, he makes a distinction between the two ways of looking at the world, two ways of experiencing the world that are basically each of our hemispheres. And one, the left hemisphere, is really focused on exactitude and certainty and knowing. And then the right hemisphere is a lot more open to ambiguity and uncertainty. So reading this, I can really see Collingwood's like left hemisphere, left brain being like totally precise and coming up with these certain definitions and laying everything out. But at the same time, he just leaves this stuff open. Well, you just can't say whether an absolute presupposition is true or not. It's just that you suppose it. You just presuppose it. And then all of your thinking is based on that presupposition, but that's kind of like off limits. And McGilchrist kind of says a similar thing, that there are certain things that you just can't prove one way or another. And the right hemisphere is fine with that. And that's kind of like the right hemisphere is cool with that kind of lack of certainty, but the left hemisphere is like, no, I need to know, is it true or not? Give me yes or no.
It's interesting because I kind of try to wrap my head around that concept like for a while now, and the thing is really if you're talking about like right hemisphere and left hemisphere thinking, you cannot really solve this problem with right hemisphere thinking. So that many people, I mean, not many people, because he didn't have that many critics, surprisingly, but those who criticized him, they, always were trying to say, oh, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, if I become conscious of one of my absolute presuppositions, why shouldn't I criticize it? And how does that exactly like fit in with the relative presuppositions, and they were like trying to like build like a whole system where everything, fits in perfectly. But the thing is, the way I understand him, and I think when reading Collingwood, you really need to open up a bit, about, or let's say like leave like this logical puzzle thing, a bit to the side and really try to understand what's going on. And I think, his idea was kind of that is like a ground, a ground of absolute presuppositions, kind of like background assumptions that give rise, to questions and to everything, all our inquiries and all that. But most of the time, we simply are either not even aware of those. And if we are, we just don't question them. It's like something that is pretty deep. And I think this is really a fascinating concept. And I haven't worked out all the ramifications too, but that's kind of what I think he's going in. And I wanted to add about your point of orderly thinking, and I think that's really like something I found very relieving with Collingwood, is that he kind of resurrects thinking, because thinking has kind of a bad reputation, because the in empirical science and ever since like the 19th century and the early 20th century, it's like, thinking, it's basically just something that converts facts, into, whatever, or it's like, the importance is always on the empirical side, and thinking is, something that is not really thought of a lot compared to like in the early days, or like before, when philosophy was all about, thinking and trying to figure out what is like the inner logic of thinking, and this idea that the thought world, so to speak, is there's something happening there, that there is something going on, and it's important, and you can actually like figure things out, and I thought that was really great when reading Collingwood, his emphasis on thinking and his criticism, on psychology as a science of thinking, so that it's like you study thinking as if it was like some object, right, that you're having in the lab. I mean, that's not to say, and he says that psychology isn't like a useful science, for dealing with feelings and things like that, and but not like, you cannot like figure out the nature of thinking with psychology, and because thinking is just something you do and you think, and orderly thinking is actually important, and there are actually things you can figure out about how to think, And I found that very refreshing. And it seems to me that this idea has come under attack from like many different directions at once. And, if you think about evolutionary psychology or something like that, where it's like, thinking is kind of like explained with some supposed past and the tigers, that were out to eat. And that's why you think this and that. And so it seems to me he's onto something that, psychology cannot really deal with thinking, and it kind of knows it, but then it tries all the time and it gets murky. And yeah, so I found that very nice. And just last thing that you talked about too, his historical approach. And I found that really, really fascinating. That he takes apart like concepts that we take for granted and shows, how these things developed, not in a kind of like evolutionary way or anything like that, but just, by humans who thought, over like a very, very long period of time. So with causality, for example, that we just take it for granted, right? So one thing causes the other. So that's it. And it's kind of like our absolute presupposition that we don't even question, but how exactly did that concept come to be, right? And then he gives like in the essay on metaphysics, he gives like a fascinating account of that. And, or like, that the idea that nature is something separate from agency. So, I mean, you could also imagine that, nature is kind of micromanaged by some god or some magician or whatever, or even some human consciousness or what have you. And so, I mean, the idea that nature is just, outside humans, and it's just, something we take totally for granted, but it's out of that eventually like things like science came to be. Right? And there's all kinds of things like that he really figures out, and he does the hard work, of actually tracing all of that and looking at the languages and what these words meant in ancient times and how certain people thought about it and how that then morphed into the next idea. And that's really, really useful to understand ourselves, basically, because to a large degree we have all these ideas that we're not even conscious of, or if we are, we don't question them, but we don't know why we have them and what they do with our thinking and what role they play in our thinking. So that's really fascinating.
Well, so one of the very interesting parts of his autobiography is, I think, his childhood and how he describes, his father's, who's a painter, permitting him to be up to his own devices. So Collingwood would, pick up books and tomes off the bookshelf and out of pure intellectual curiosity, study history and study ideas. He would take machines and tools apart and reconstruct them. And so he had this kind of natural curiosity and interest in how things worked. And it wasn't until I think he was 13 years old when a rich friend of the family had paid for schooling for Collingwood. So he didn't have any of this kind of pre-filtered ideas about what was what. He sort of got a long distance into his own growth, and he also describes periods of time in which he was idle and did very little. But he got somewhere on his own steam. And you said, Luke, that he was really a very rigorous thinker. And that is because it seems to me he came at everything from his own raw, undeveloped. That seemed to be the kernel or seed of his impetus to go into philosophy. This natural kind of wanting to know what was what in a very real sense. When there was the the realist school developing at around the time that he was in his 20s and was all the rage and the most popular, he describes putting ideas out there that were shot down. And he makes a joke of it. He says, if I were to propose an alternate idea or something that was kind of outside of the scope of the realist school, they would come back at me and say, well, this is what you really mean to say. And they would do it with such certainty and such conviction and power that, he could admire it for how well it sounded and how utterly successful it was in destroying his idea. But nonetheless, he was able to look back and say, yeah, but you're still wrong, if only to himself. And
yeah, but I thought that was like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just thought, this I could kind of like emphasize with him when with that passage, and I think many of us probably can, right? So if you figure out some interesting idea, and then you go to someone who's like really smart, really clever, but not really interesting, or not really wise or whatever, and he just, gets at you and just argues you to the ground, with some kind of methods and logic and what have you, and it doesn't even, in the final analysis have to make a lot of sense, but so I found that really interesting, this kind of, could almost call it sophistry, right? And as he describes, his teachers that had developed this so-called critical method, like critical theory, something like that, and just that was just so toxic because it could like debunk everything, and you end up like with nothing, every theory you touch, everything everyone has ever said, you can just destroy, with that kind of method, with that kind of logic, and he gives the example also of like this propositional logic, he calls it that kind of tries to uncover like contradictions and things like that, and he explains how this often totally fails because you can only compare two things, if they are answers to the same question, and you cannot just take a random statement from the text, and say, oh, look, if we if you crazy philosophers say the world is one and many, so you take it apart, say in two statements, A, the world is one, B, the world is many. Ha, you're contradicting yourself. Your theory is nonsense. It's like, it doesn't work that way. I mean, this statement could actually make a lot of sense, depending on what actually was going on, in the mind of the one who wrote it and what he was trying to figure out. So I just wanted to say, like, I could really emphasize with Collingwood there. He works something out and goes to some of his elders, and they just completely destroy him, and he goes like discouraged, back to his hole and never writes, anything again. Thankfully he didn't do that, but yeah.
Well, he had a brilliant strategy for that, which was, he continued to write and in some cases get shot down, but he resolved to whatever he would say that, his circle of academics and philosophers and historians basically wrote for each other. But what he resolved to do was, since he wouldn't meet with any success because he wasn't part of that sexy clique of the realist school, he would carry it forward to his students. So if his students came to him and would say something like, well, I just heard this from, so-and-so about what Aristotle mentioned regarding, this ideal or that. And Collingwood would say, okay, let's look at what he really said here. He would open up a book and he would say, what was the question that Aristotle had firmly in mind when he was attempting to say this. And this gets back to answering questions and having this organized, orderly system of thought that he was trying to impart onto his students. Because, sadly, this wasn't something that he could engage. This level of rigor that he had already defined for himself and lived by was something that was beyond these, this kind of hot clique of philosophers that had taken Oxford by storm at the time. So it's interesting to me that he was able to still give life to his own ideas about how history should be looked at philosophically and how philosophy should be looked at historically. He didn't make generalizations in the way that many of his peers would make, where, if you really drilled down into what they were saying, he could pick things apart. But owing to the fact that this clique of realist philosophers would kind of buy into their own shtick and listen to each other, he had to set himself apart and just make a stand for rigorous thinking and making distinctions where other thinkers weren't making distinctions.
And so going back to something that you had said earlier, Luke, he actually has in his biography, chapter 10 is called History as the Self-Knowledge of Mind. And that's the title of the chapter. And he, kind of lays out that idea where history, and this is something that I got from reading his book, Idea of History, where history, when you look at it and you analyze it and you see how other people think, and you realize, and then you are able to think that for yourself. So then you, in a sense, become that person. So you are now more aware of how you can think by living out how other people think. And so you become more aware of yourself by learning about other people, by learning about history. And so it becomes this exploration of self, history does, which I thought was a really cool way of looking at things, because it gives history so much more significance. And instead of it being, just this dry thing of stuff that happened in the past, it's very much a real part of who you are by being able to engage with it in that way. And then to take that even further, then this isn't anything that he said specifically, but it's kind of the implication, or it's implied in some of the things that he says, where you were talking about his criticisms of the realist school, where he looks at it almost as a form of mental masturbation. Again, he doesn't say that specifically or explicitly, but it's kind of implied by the way that he talks about them, where they're just, they're in their sexy clique, mm-hmm. and they're just talking to each other to seem more knowledgeable and cool or whatever. And you can get that too with scientists, where they have a very cliquish mindset, and so they're each trying to. It's this form of one-upmanship that is meant to aggrandize themselves and to the detriment of the actual science that they're supposed to be, working for, which is supposed to be for the good of all. But it just becomes a narcissistic thing. And so then with science itself, you were talking about history as being cut and paste, and that's something that he talks about a lot, is where history is generally just a cutting and pasting of this authority here said this, cut and put that into the new history book that says, historian X wrote X or wrote Y. And then that's basically history. And then science, in this similar way to how you described it earlier, science, generally speaking, is very similar in a very cut and paste way, where it's like nature does X, and so we write that down, and so now the law is X, and there's no real thinking there. It's just an observation and then writing it down. There's no real interaction with it if it's done in that kind of a way. But the way that Collingwood approaches history and philosophy, it gives all of these things more life and more meaning and more value, because you become part of all of this, because it's all reflections of you as a person and what you see and what you're able to see. And so that was, kind of, just getting back to some of the things you said about what makes Collingwood so interesting. I think this is what makes him so interesting to me is how he's able to take all of these different things, turn them on their heads, and by so doing, breathe new life into them. Philosophy isn't this dry thing where it's just a bunch of, intellectual people, just doing it for their own kicks and giggles. Like it really does matter.
Well, this is probably a good time to, maybe we should have started with something like this, but, well, we've kind of been skirting around the edges of it, but why philosophy is actually useful, because we've said a lot of like nasty things about philosophers. But I want to read some quotes from some philosophers that McGilchrist put together, and then we can discuss and see what they have to say. So first of all, I'll read one from, this is from, I don't know, let's see what his name is. His last name is Earl, William Earl. This was from the middle of the 20th century. He's a philosopher, and this is from an essay called Notes on the Death of Culture. So he's writing about an assumption, which he calls the fervent assumption, that the philosopher himself is entitled only to analyze. That is, his work consists in tearing apart intellectually phrases others have put together. He analyzes syntheses, but he makes no synthesis himself. To ask a technical philosopher for his vision of the world is to throw him into the worst of embarrassments. It is hopelessly to misunderstand what philosophy now is. The philosopher's answer will not try to supply that vision or even recognize its absence. Rather, it will analyze the meaning of your question in order to show that it really has no meaning at all. It is left for others to supply the vision. And so Earl concludes his essay. Now, this was not always so. For the longest stretch of its history, philosophy was, embarrassing as it is to technical philosophy, concerned precisely with large visions and the edifying. That is, it was concerned with the human situation and what was to be done about it. The new philosopher need know in his professional capacity absolutely nothing except how words are used. In any event, pure knowledge has nothing to do here. It seeks absolute purity, absolute independence, and absolute irrelevance to anything anyone might conceivably be interested in. Thus has a noble discipline committed suicide. And then another one, he quotes, he quotes this from, well, what's philosophy actually good for? So Whitehead, a philosopher who we've talked about before, who Collingwood had many disagreements with, but also appreciated in many ways.
Was also a fan, yeah.
Yes. Philosophy, as Whitehead saw, is the, quote, very foundation of thought and of life. The sort of ideas we attend to, the sort of ideas which we push into the negligible background, govern our hopes, our fears, our control of behavior. As we think, we live. This is why the assemblage of philosophic ideas is more than a specialist study. It molds our type of civilization. Now, this kind of gets back to what Collingwood writes about absolute presuppositions, because when you look at the presuppositions of a time and place, I mean, oftentimes, well, in more ways than we think, we are governed by the ideas of our time, and oftentimes that means the ideas of philosophers whose names we don't know of, whose ideas we don't know of, but through that process of life, of just the nature of humans and human society and culture, those ideas become our presuppositions. Now, it might work the other way around sometimes. Philosophers might just be expressing the presuppositions that are around them, but oftentimes at the very least, it becomes those philosophers who then start influencing people. And if we're operating on like a certain worldview, a certain vision that is, let's say, that has some profound deficiencies, then that has knock-on effects. We're living downstream from that vision, and with an uncritical acceptance of certain, let's say, certain presuppositions, that influences the way we interact, it influences what we see, even. It influences the questions we ask, and then the answers that we come up with, and conceivably can lead to a disaster. And does lead to disaster. So one of the things McGilchrist is on about is this presupposition that of the machine model, that nature is mechanical, that biology is mechanical, that we should see everything, or that we do see everything in terms of machines. And he spends hundreds and hundreds of pages just showing how that is present in our worldview, and how it's presupposed by a lot of the science that's done, and how and the effects that then has, and then alternatives to that. So what it would look like to adopt a different presupposition, or a different set or constellation of presuppositions. I wanted to. Okay, I'll read one more quote on philosophy. Maybe two. These are from another philosopher, Friedrich Waismann. I'm not familiar with this guy, just like I wasn't familiar with Earl until I read these quotes, but kind of like an overview of philosophy. Waismann writes, "To put the matter in a nutshell, a philosophical argument does more and does less than a logical one. Less in that it never establishes anything conclusively. More in that, if successful, it is not content to establish just one isolated point of truth, but effects a change in our whole mental outlook, so that, as a result of that, myriads of such little points are brought into view or turned out of sight, as the case may be." And maybe one other from Waismann. Let's see. "What is essential in philosophy is the breaking through to a deeper insight, which is something positive, and not merely dissipation of fog or the exposure of spurious problems. Insight cannot be lodged in a theorem, and it can therefore not be demonstrated. It is dangerous in philosophy to hunt for premises instead of just going over the ground, standing back and saying, 'Look.'" So part of I guess what we've been talking about, and what McGilchrist is getting across with those quotations and what he says about those thinkers, is that there are downfalls and pitfalls to a certain philosophical approach, especially that analytic one that just tears apart and doesn't actually provide anything. But there's also like a kind of grand importance to philosophy, whether people want to realize it or not. Maybe they've been put off by maybe university courses where they've had to read the just kind of tedium of a lot of modern philosophers, where it sounds like it wasn't written by a human, because, well, partially it wasn't. It wasn't written by a complete human. It was written by this part of the brain of one philosopher that's just ignoring like the rest of his humanity. Because that's the way that's the way they learn to write. That's what they think they should do. But like Earl had said, they end up writing something that it's inconceivable for anyone to be even interested in, because it's just mental masturbation, as Adam said. Thoughts, Luke?
Yeah, maybe because we don't want to bash like everything too hard. Now, I mean, there is some interesting things in analytic philosophy as well. So I wouldn't. I mean, the Earl quote was definitely geared, towards the analytic tradition. And I think that there's lots of truth in that, but to put on like the other cliche, the one that the analytic philosophers always hate and bash, it's kind of like this, salon philosopher who just, talks about like not like unhinged thoughts about, the world and whatever, and or just, the kind of like magazine essayist type. So I think there's still like a difference between that, and like what Collingwood calls like orderly, systematic thinking. So it's not and it's good that I think that I mentioned it to, make that distinction. If you criticize analytic philosophy, it doesn't mean, that you want to throw out like systematic thinking, and that's not the point. And you don't suddenly transform into like a bohemian, randomly philosophizing about the world. So that's not the point. But this is still it's kind of like the two, the two, not camps, but the two cliches, let's say.
There needs to be a balance.
So I just and but there's not. I think there's still like quite a few things wrong with analytic philosophy, and so I don't know if you want to talk about that. But the point is just a certain like rigidity is the wrong word, but like a certain care and systematic and logical thinking. Logical, not in the sense of formal logic necessarily, just really deep and hard thinking. So that's really, really important. And about the machine model, I think that's really interesting, and it's a great example for an absolute presupposition, I think, because it seems to me many discussions in philosophy, they may say different things, but they what they're thinking about actually is machine stuff. So it's all about data input, computation, and input output, and things like that, and sensation. The word has acquired kind of like a bit of a sensor kind of meaning, like in computer sensors, and so even like all the words that are around for a long time, they kind of got infected a bit, with this computer machine type connotations, and I think that and people aren't aware. So the question, as Collingwood would say, doesn't even arise. Maybe to contrast that, because you also said McGilchrist writes about what may be the alternatives. I don't know, but just for contrast, like Collingwood approaches it, and traditional philosophy has approached it more or less, is to really take concepts seriously. So, for example, if you talk about virtue, or duty, that is kind of like a concept that has meaning and that you can, analyze and think out consequences and relationships and actually gain understanding. And so, for example, I think that's from one of Collingwood's book too, the example when you experience cold or heat, so an old school philosopher would, ask, so why is it that, when the temperature rises, suddenly it's not cold, but it's something different entirely, namely heat. It switches. It's a completely new experience, right? It has nothing. It's not like a scale, that just keeps adding
negative
temperature. No,
coldness.
it's cold, and then and that's the way like modern people would think about it, and a modern like philosopher, or just random guy would probably say like, what's your point? It's like temperature rises, and even he maybe would even come up with evolutionary kind of thinking, and so the cold, is bad for the body and the heat is bad for the body. So the body has developed sensors, to distinguish between them to survive. And it's just, one signal, heat, and the other signal is cold. And that's just what it is, end of story. And it wouldn't even the question wouldn't even come up, maybe there's a meaning, or maybe you can compare that to different scales of concepts where there may be similarities, that suddenly something jumps and becomes something different, and you could rethink hard about it, but the question wouldn't even arise, for most modern people, and that's really interesting, how these presuppositions work, because you may be aware that you think in terms of machine stuff, but you're not aware that you can, or you just simply cannot think differently anymore. So it definitely seems like it's like these ideas have a profound impact in the long run. How they affect humanity's thinking and thought patterns. And Collingwood actually believed that that you cannot really change them, even with a concerted effort. So you kind of just have to sit it out. The way he describes it is that eventually, it can have different reasons. Maybe philosophers have new ideas. Maybe science comes up with new concepts and new ideas, and eventually, as he puts it, the old set of presuppositions, they become strained. They come under strain. And certain internal contradictions become apparent, and and at one point, it's just too much, and they break, and then something new emerges, or it gets modified in any event. So that's kind of his take on it. That it's a bit deterministic, or fatalistic rather. And that's the way he thought about it. And there's also a warning in this, and this I found also kind of interesting to think about, even though I'm still not sure what I should think about it. But the warning is that we actually should kind of affirm the presuppositions that we have, so that there is no point in just battling them, but actually we should kind of affirm them. And the way I understand this is that we should kind of work with what we have, and not try to cut the branch we're sitting on too fast, so that we, for example, we live in a kind of materialist thought world, right? So where this kind of materialist and machine thinking is very prevalent. And I think his point is kind of to take this example from our time, that we can, work from this framework. We shouldn't maybe just proclaim, oh no, everything is mind, or whatever. But because it's we have these presuppositions, and we kind of need to fight our way out of it if we want to change something. But we should be careful, just not to apply deconstructivist logic or whatever, and just zap all those presuppositions, but because then we have nothing, and we have nothing to work with really. So anyway, that's my take on it at the moment, but it's interesting to think about.
Well, that's a very Jordan Peterson-esque warning, and kind of rightly so, because if you just go around, cutting off all the branches on a tree, because some of the limbs might be diseased, well, you might end up cutting the branch that you're sitting on, and then where do you end up but on the ground with a few broken limbs, and you kind of screwed at that point. So that's very Peterson-esque, and probably apropos.
But yeah, I'm not sure what I think about that yet too. But one of the things that he says in the essay on metaphysics is one of the roles of I think this is what he says, one of the roles of a philosopher, one of the things that a philosopher does is to, how to put it, to essentially try on presuppositions, to say, okay, well, because that's what a presupposition is. That's what a supposition is that it doesn't, just the mere fact of supposing it is what leads to the thinking that proceeds from it. It's like, well, if I were to suppose X, then, Y and Z and all this stuff. And it's, so you perform almost like a thought experiment. Well, based on this supposition, then you engage in your thinking based on that supposition, because that's all suppositions are. It's just that with the case of absolute presuppositions and doing metaphysics, it's the analysis of what are people actually presupposing. And it's a bit harder to do in the contemporary context because your own thinking is probably permeated by them. But that's not to say it's impossible, but it's perfectly reasonable to be able to say, okay, well, what if we adopt these different presuppositions? But then you approach a conflict because let's say that you don't want to rock the boat too much, but you adopt a new set of presuppositions in your orderly thinking, and you find out, oh, well, this actually looks really good. I like this a lot more than I like these other presuppositions. Then it's a difficult situation to be in.
Well, then you become Collingwood, and everyone hates you.
Yeah.
But even Collingwood. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, even Collingwood, at one point in his autobiography says, "Oh, Speculum Mentis was a mess, and it wasn't a very good book that I wrote." And then later he says, "Oh, I reread it, and it's not so bad. It just needs to be qualified a little bit, and certain ideas expounded upon." So for him, philosophy was this living thing that he was constantly refining and working on, and there was never any kind of endpoint per se. It was this. It was a part of his being. It was a part of his growth as a philosopher, as a thinker, as a human being, and maybe that's kind of what's missing in the presentation of philosophy in the West. It's that it's not necessarily an endpoint, but an ongoing learning, an ongoing acquiring of knowledge.
And that's why a lot of people don't like it, is because they want the certainty.
Yes. And that's, I think, what is so, you mentioned that he was coming up against scientism, or an earlier version of scientism in his time. And scientism, as part of this kind of nihilistic worldview, where, everything is a shortcut. Everything is a kind of summarized, easy, certain, powerful answer to certain questions that maybe are not even good questions. And you also talked about how they were dismissive of moral philosophy in that movement, and how he felt like, this is getting back to the example of cutting off the limb on the tree that you may be sitting on, where an exploration of higher values is what's been cut out of contemporary philosophy. Maybe I'm not so well read that I can say that with any certainty, but we certainly see a lot of ideas that we're swimming in without any mooring, that feel nihilistic, that feel godless and valueless and
degenerate.
Degenerate. There was something else that I wanted.
It's the old, yeah. To your point, it's the empiricist contradiction. In the sense that if you say everything is just empirical, and therefore empirical science is everything that we need ever. But then this statement in itself is not an empirical statement, right? And that's always the issue with these kinds of things, and with scientism and all the, there were very many movements that try to solve this problem. It came up with all kinds of things, and logical atomism, that thought that, in language you can kind of analyze like logical particles that all correspond to reality. But the point is, if that's just not how it works, and it also it cuts you off from all values, from all knowledge that can be gained by orderly, deep thought, and that's really kind of like the cutting of the limb or the branch. So in that sense, I would agree that everything in terms of values and things like that, it just becomes nonsense. They actually, like Wittgenstein and the early one actually said so. And lots of philosophers at the time and still today, that just ethical thinking is just nonsense. And just to add maybe one thing to that, because I actually wrote, took a note when I read it in Collingwood's autobiography. I wrote sad, so sad at the margins, because like this eradication of moral education, right? It's really sad, because you can be cynical about it, and say, to study old Greeks and talk about virtues and duties and what have you. You cannot ever like establish like a rule book that really can guide your life. It will never like be perfect or or just enough, to know how to live a good life. But that's not really the point, as you guys said earlier. It's a process, and just thinking about virtue, is just helps. If you just think a little bit about it, and the concept, comes to life, and you gain an understanding, and you develop principles, just by thinking about these things. And that's totally lost in modern thought. It began in that's why his work is so interesting as well, because it's really like at that time that a lot of these movements that are still with us today, they kind of have their origin or culminated, let's say, and moral relativism for sure is like very strong at the time, and really it's really sad, because they treat morality as a science now. It's something that you study. Why do people behave like that? Oh, it's because they gain X. That they help their tribe. That or at some like imaginary past. It's just help the tribe. So people are like a bit altruistic, and and that kind of thinking. You try to analyze morality scientifically, as if it was like billiard balls, that you can measure or whatever, and so much is lost, with that kind of thinking, because you, if you think about it in terms of virtue and principles, like Jordan Peterson does, he's a philosopher, right? He's also a psychologist, but he's also a philosopher, and that really speaks to people, because there is something there, and to just eradicate that from education and from thinking in general, and just treat morality as a science is really, I guess, at the root of a lot of evil, and it makes you also susceptible to all kinds of manipulation, and you just have no firm ground, and it becomes all a matter of emotions, and
when you were speaking of that and scientism and empiricism, I was reminded of the molecular biologists, and we had a guy on the show who was an electrical engineer who wrote about intelligent design. And you have all these scientists who are true scientists, I think, who look at a version of the mechanistic universe, but they take it as far as they possibly can. They are trying to ask questions based on their lifelong pursuit of knowledge and understanding what it is that they're seeing on the micro level, on the on the electric universe level. And they're coming to a conclusion from their point of view that actually points to a higher value, to a universe that is filled with meaning, to a world that is infused with value and what must be a injection of information at higher levels of existence or reality. So just something that came to mind as we were talking about all that that there's being mechanistic in a dogmatic way, in a limiting way, in a way that doesn't allow for the possibilities. And then there is the true scientist, I think, who can even see how the mechanistic fits with the non-mechanistic, because they've followed their pursuit and their rigorous thinking, and they're making distinctions to a very far degree.
Yeah, and that's maybe what Collingwood means, or at least my interpretation, that you cannot, or you maybe even should not, like, just abandon, your absolute presuppositions willy-nilly, because they open up questions, right? So if you have a certain set of presuppositions, they give rise to certain questions that maybe other presuppositions don't give rise to. And in this kind of like mechanistic model, it just gives rise to certain questions and to certain research programs. And it's not that they cannot be like insightful or useful, right? And that's maybe also, or like Harrison said, with to kind of put on different hats, maybe that's the ultimate goal, to be able to really switch presuppositions by a deep study of their history and also their history as it plays out, in the present, and maybe then to become such a super being that you can like switch them and actually see through different research programs under different presuppositions and different grounds that give rise to certain questions. I don't know, but yeah, and that's, I guess, how you can reconcile something like a mechanistic outlook. It's not that it's completely useless, right? I mean, and it can produce knowledge.
Super supposition man. It's the superposition of suppositions in the form of a superhero. That's what we're going for.
The new SS.
Sounds like a nerdy comic book idea right there.
We've got plenty of them.
Yes. We just have to find an artist to do all of our nerdy ideas. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think that would be pretty... Well, that reminds me of a point that I started to make early on and then I didn't. And that was something funny that Collingwood writes in the essay on metaphysics, where it's in this one of the sections on absolute presuppositions, where he's laying out the initial groundwork for them, and he's talking about how in a conversation with any scientist, you can engage in a kind of Socratic dialogue with them, where you kind of question their answers to find their questions, and then there will be a certain point where you ask, well, what's your justification for this, or how do you get here, or whatever. I can't remember the exact question. And at that point, there's like a breaking point where the person you're talking to will get very nervous and defensive and even violent. And he says that's the point at which you know that you've reached their absolute presupposition. It's because, and he says, I can respect that response. I can respect the ticklishness with which they hold their absolute presuppositions, but because it shows at some level they know that what was it, that they can't justify them, or that I think that was what it was, that they can't justify them because they're not justifiable. They're just presupposed. And so the process of being able to identify your own absolute presuppositions, and then to realize what they are, and then to conceivably take on new ones and try them on, see how they look, then that in itself is kind of a process that you go through to kind of get over that ticklishness, which is essentially egotism, in yourself. So you actually learn something about yourself and gain a little bit of self-control in the process, and you're a little bit less of an emotional machine. So you can kind of attack that mechanicalness within yourself, to use the machine metaphor. I'm just basically saying there seems to be more to that process. It's almost like on an emotional level, where, because he does mention that the way he puts it, I think he says on some level they're aware. Well, how about you get to that level? That maybe there's an advantage to being able to get to that level, and I think that's probably, or maybe, kind of one of those advantages of philosophy is that by learning to think and to be less just like automatically attached to your ideas, to be able to kind of, I can't remember how he puts it in the beginning, if it's just thinking orderly, but thinking deeply, thinking scientifically, I think is how he puts it, is just to put it thinking scientifically in the broad sense of thinking orderly. Just by engaging in that, not only does your thinking become clearer, but on an emotional level, you lose that prickliness of
attachment.
Yeah, of being poked. You're pushing my buttons. You're getting a little too close to the bone. When you ask those questions, when you identify these things that I haven't thought about, that have repercussions, that have implications for what I do, because in this context with the scientists, like, this is their entire being. I am or a biologist or whatever. And when you get to the bottom of it, to say to imply that, the entire basis of everything that you do is a presupposition that you can't prove. That it kind of has the emotion that is attached with that is, there's the chance that that my entire work and everything that I see myself as is worthless and not true, potentially not true, and potentially I'm going down this blind alley, and I have been for my entire professional career. Well, and that's not necessarily what it means, because once you actually realize the nature of a presupposition, it's like, no, it's just that there's not as much certainty attached to it. It's like, you still find useful stuff because you find useful things by presupposing, because that's the only way you can get anywhere. The only way you can answer a question is by having a question, and the only way you could have a question is by having a supposition, like to ask that question.
Well, there's another thing at play here, and it gets back to work terms, and it's identification with what one believes and thinks, and all of that kind of emotional attachment that's connected to egotism that you mentioned. And that's why I love that passage that I mentioned a little earlier about his, presenting an idea to people who brilliantly just destroy it and shoot it down, and do it in such a way and with such panache that even Collingwood himself can go, "Oh, you guys are awesome." That's just, that is just brilliant destruction. But,
beautiful destruction.
Beautiful. But also, he's so confident in his own process, in the work he's done to get to where he is, that he knows precisely why, what the failing of the criticism is, and why he can continue to work on this idea that's just been publicly shot down, because he doesn't have this identification or attachment that's connected to ego. It's all about the sincere pursuit, the kind of intellectually honest questioning that he's developed for himself, and something that we aspire to, I think, for ourselves.
And that's something that he kind of gets into, I think it's fairly early on in his autobiography, where he's talking about ideas is like there's no such thing as like an absolutely right idea. Nothing that we ever think or are ever going to think is going to be 100% true. Ever, period, full stop. That's just the nature of limited being, which is what we are, as limited beings. And so it's like he embraced that simple fact, that simple, uncomfortable fact that you're wrong. No matter what it is that you think, you're wrong.
What's the line from that Coen Brothers movie? With the Asian character? Embrace the contradiction or something. Do you remember?
The ambiguity?
Ambiguity? I can't remember what the word is. Darn. There's a meme for it. But
It might be ambiguity, but...
Well, yeah, it's just... it's just embracing that simple fact that you're going to be wrong no matter what it is. So you just kind of accept it as being like, yeah, I could be wrong, but...
Or at least you're never going to be totally right.
Yeah, or at the very least, I'm never going to be totally right. And so that takes your ego out of it to a certain extent, because rather than being 100% certain that you're 100% right, you're 100% certain that you're not 100% right.
And it takes anxiety out of it too, because I think there's a lot of existential and logical anxiety that people get in when they, like the person confronted with their absolute presuppositions. Like there's an anxiety that's involved in, like there's a fear, and you can just get rid of it. It's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, any final thoughts?
It's interesting because most people, I just that's probably not like a final thought material, but maybe I could just finish by saying it's interesting what's going on in terms of philosophy at the moment. I think especially like on the internet and on the independent front, I've come across some examples of people leaving academia and doing their own thing, founding their own institutes and stuff, and so that's kind of interesting. And I would just say, like, if to the listeners, just have the courage to read things that you're interested in terms of philosophy, and don't be afraid to come up with your own thoughts, about it, and even write about it if you're up to it, or just write about it for yourself, because you can actually figure things out, and don't be afraid, like of those guys like Collingwood's teacher, who will shut you down, and beautifully destroy all your ideas, because that's not really the point. The point is to get a bit closer to the truth, to develop your thoughts, and it can be intimidating, and sometimes people think, I need to read like 500 classics, before I can even like think about anything, and that's really not true. And if you read Collingwood's Autobiography, that's enough. I think you will have plenty of material to think about. But that's just as an encouragement, because I know this from myself as well. This philosophy is just very intimidating, and this has this huge tradition going back millennia, and but it doesn't have to be that way. And as long as you think orderly and systematic, nothing can go wrong.
Cool. Any other final thoughts, guys? All right, then thanks for joining us, Luke. We'll be having you back on, hopefully regularly. But it was great talking to you. Fun talking about Collingwood, and we'll come back to him too. I'm sure we'll read more and have some thoughts to share on some of his other ideas. I think I want to come back again to Principles of Art sometime, but other stuff too. So hope you enjoyed it. We'll have some links to some Collingwood books below, to that article we mentioned. And thanks for tuning in. We'll talk again later. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me on. Bye-bye.